Okay, I think we're good. Perfect. Right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this talk. And this is the third one out of the 4 that I'll be doing. Tonight's session is talking about, obviously, autonomy for your child. It's looking at the emotional state and how from a high performance sports state that we can get your child to perform at their best level. I think often, especially in psychology and probably from your own experience watching your child, those in a high level performance, you often see children perform extremely well in training. And then when it comes to the actual performance, not every child, but sometimes the majority of children, and obviously going into adolescence and adulthood, we do see a lot of people or athletes kind of have a drop off in performance. And often this is due to the culture being set by the team, the culture being set by the coaches, and more importantly, the culture being set by the parents at home, kind of expectations being set on that child and that athlete. And so tonight's session is trying to hopefully kind of give you 1, maybe 2 kind of bits of advice that from a sports psychology point of view that is used in elite sport that can obviously enhance your child's performance. But not only that, perhaps, I've had emails from previous sessions where people not only find benefits for their children, but also find benefits in terms of they can apply to their own working profession, and they can use day-to-day, actually enhance the performance in their working life, which is absolutely brilliant. If you have been on the 2 previous sessions, which was obviously on goal setting and the challenge and threat states, then there is a little bit of kind of a crossover. And the reason for that is ultimately challenge state, threat state, the goal setting stuff, the coping mechanisms is all very fundamental towards sport performance. We know from that elite perspective, we're looking for those 1% gains. And sometimes, well, we know psychology is going to be the part of the anchor is going to obviously get your athlete or get your child across the line, which is what we're going to be looking at this evening. So it's going to be looking at the emotions, the moods, and how we are able to formulate an environment, a culture with the added coping mechanisms that's going to obviously enhance your performance of your child in this session. So I hope you get a lot out of it. For those who don't know me, obviously I'm Joshua, Mr. Trigwell. I'm currently based at the Boys Prep, where I do a lot of one-to-one work with children, sometimes in group settings as well, where it's my role to work with the SEN department, but provide kind of physical intervention work alongside more of a kind of holistic approach as well. I've just completed my master's in sport and exercise psychology, and now obviously beginning the journey now to become a fully qualified sports psychologist in the next kind of 2 years or so, and obviously working with elite teams, elite individuals. Ferrari outside, and go by. So to become a qualified sports psychologist, and in doing so, I've also worked with individual teams and obviously athletes as well on an individual level, at national level, and international level as well. So with that, it's kind of me being a coach and also advising at the same time. So to kind of get right into it, defining emotion. So we know through sports psychology, there are often 2 different methods of emotion. We have public emotion, which, as you can see, is seen in our facial expressions, body language. And often when we encounter, from a sport performance point of view, someone experiencing an emotion, it is seen physically through visual cues. And often we know that the first thing is the more you feed into the emotion and kind of make it more visual to everyone else, the more the emotion intensifies, which we'll kind of get into later on how to obviously cope with that. And also we have the private way, which is obviously the conscious experience that you deal with, between 4 walls and kind of deal with yourself in that given time. There are 2 different types. Obviously, we have mood and emotions. Mood is something, as you can see from the quote from Lazarus 1991, is more based upon life events. So what's going on in your life currently, and normally that can shape your day-to-day mood and how you feel. We know obviously through psychology, your mental health, as much as we want people to become fixated on developing a good mental health, it really is kind of a pendulum. You know, your mental health is kind of going good and bad and sometimes okay on a day-to-day basis, depending on what you are experiencing on a day-to-day. Emotions, on the other hand, is something that we as psychologists, or should I say those psychologists in sport especially, is something we have far more control of and something we can have immediate effect on. The analogy I like to use with mood and emotions is often mood is like a slow wood burner. It's there, it can be there for a long time. It's something you can work on a day-to-day basis through a stage-by-stage process. Whereas emotions is something from a psychologist working with an athlete, you can tackle pretty much very quickly, given the right coping strategies to deal with that. And so if we look at it from an athlete perspective, emotions is like someone dealing with a wrong decision in a football match or rugby match. It's someone dealing with something going wrong in a game situation. Perhaps in a marathon, someone's missed their fueling station. What we as sports psych's job is to do there is to give them the coping strategies, deal with that in the moment, which we're going to tap into later on in the presentation. But it is really important to define the difference between what mood is and what emotion is. And we know that emotion, as it says, is typically very intense, it's typically very in the here and now, whereas mood is obviously more of a fixated thing that is done over a long period of time. So the first thing that kind of can trigger emotions, and I'm going to be talking a lot about emotions because I see it a lot, not obviously in school, but I see it a lot in terms of on television, watching sporting events. I see it a lot in coaching. Sometimes when athletes aren't getting the results they want to achieve, and sometimes when wrong decisions are given the wrong way. When I've worked in kind of academies and observation times, you see a lot of the coaches working to create an environment where sometimes wrong decisions can be made, and how the athlete can adapt their game in that given moment to prioritize and optimize their performance. One of the first things to kind of make apparent is how an athlete appraises the situation. So as you can see a few bullet points here, every athlete is appraising an environment with a different perspective. Not one person is walking into a room, walking into a performance with the same mentality as the person next to them. It's like going for a job interview. We've all been there. We know what experience. Every single person, if there's 100 candidates, every single individual of those 100 candidates will be experiencing different emotions on a different scale. Walking into that room to be interviewed with a different heightened emotion of some sort. It's how we as people appraise that situation and appraise that environment. Same being with how an athlete will appraise a situation going into a match or going into their performance. The same way an athlete is, as it says there, an athlete being criticised by their coach. Some athletes will view that criticism constructively, but will feel obviously a feeling of sadness and guilt, whereas other athletes may actually believe that what they're experiencing is unwarranted, and obviously then feel anger and frustration. So again, it's how we perceive these different environments is going to make a huge difference. And so as a sports psych in that scenario, what we're looking to achieve here is how we can help an athlete approach the situation more challenging, rather than an athlete perceiving it as more frustrating. So one of the biggest things that I notice with children in particular is when I'm working with them and I'm putting forward a situation where they have to do a physical test. It could be a 1.2 kilometer time trial running. It could be a speed balance test. It could be box jumps test. It could be a sprinting test. I've noticed typically most children and sometimes adults will automatically go into negative thinking. So commonly what I hear from children is, I'm going to fail. And my first thought isn't to kind of battle that thought. It's often to kind of say, well, why? What's the thinking behind that? And every child will give me kind of a different answer. And I often say to them, it's more about actually you underpinning that and understanding, and I'm sure all of you know this, that your brain is essentially a defensive mechanism. So it's trying to protect you, it's trying to defend you. So it will automatically have a negative bias. One of the first bit of advice I can give to you for an athlete and if it's your child in this instance, who's perhaps suffering from performance anxiety or having moments of doubt or self-doubt in their game, in their technique, or going into a performance, they're not feeling confident or don't feel worthy being in that situation, and they're having these kind of self-doubts, my first thought is to say to them, rather than viewing this as a place where you could embarrass yourself or could, fear of losing or fear of, or failing, your automatic response should be, and again, not to succeed. It should be a way in which you're viewing it as an opportunity to give yourself the best platform to elevate yourself. So rather than going from failure to success, it should be failure to opportunity. We know that with opportunity comes rewards if done correctly, but if things don't go well, that's absolutely fine as well. Okay. One of the other things I'm going to touch on with the appraisal was, I'll actually get into it later with the coping mechanisms. I think be more apparent then. So cognitive consequences of heightened emotions is often athletes who are experiencing heightened emotions of excitement, anxiety. There are sometimes some good cues that we can tap into. So, but often we see athletes fall into irrelevant cue thinking. So what this means that because of the heightened physiological state they're under, normally due to the release of cortisol into the body, which is obviously the stress hormone, athletes become more focused on irrelevant cues. So irrelevant cues could be the score, it could be where your opponent is, it could be how you're feeling in that moment, or focusing on the negatives. It also could be focusing on the crowd noise, focusing on negative language being aimed at you, and it could be thinking what the manager's thinking about me in that given moment. You're focusing completely on relevant cues, putting all those things together. You're then obviously having a bad outcome performance because you're not focused on task relevant cues that need to be addressed. You're not focusing on things that could actually enhance your performance at that moment. You're focusing on everything that could go wrong, and it probably will go wrong. So what we often see with athletes who are, again, experiencing performance anxiety is a narrow kind of perspective, a narrow kind of arousal attention that's going to affect them accordingly. And even to the point where it can actually affect them in terms of their fine motor skills. So you may see sometimes at the highest level in football or rugby, simple sports to explain it by. Football could be a very, very bad first touch. In rugby, it could be, I'm going to catch the ball. And this is at of the professional level. And athletes struggling to do this because they are fixated on the negative, the irrelevant cues. So what we need to do with that, which we'll tap into later, is trying to regulate the arousal of the athlete, regulate their emotions, which obviously come from coping skills, and help them obviously be able to regulate and perform at the level where they can focus on relevant cues and obviously, yes, acknowledge irrelevant cues, but also put them to a side, understand that these aren't important for me right now. And that's going to be a big game changer in terms of your child, the athlete, being able to perform at the level that they want to and want to achieve at. We also have obviously the threat state that we mentioned. So on different conditions of threat, gymnasts fixate more on threat, lack of crash mats, in higher threat conditions. So again, this is again focusing on how they are appraising the situation. Are they appraising the situation in a challenge state or a threat state? If they're appraising the situation in a threat state, which essentially, if you remember from the previous chats I've done, a threat state is the athlete believing that they have insufficient coping mechanisms from a psychological point of view, and they have insufficient physiological mechanisms to cope in this environment. Thus, they then think about the negative scenarios and more likely to unfulfill their potential in that given moment. Okay. Other things is other emotions may take an athlete's attention away from the current moment. So as I've mentioned already, a lot of clubs these days are, especially at Premiership level, and I imagine that's going to Championship, League One, League Two. In my sport, in marathon running, you may see a lot of it in terms of missing a station for your fueling station. What we see a lot of clubs doing now is purposefully creating game scenarios where decisions go wrong for the athlete. So if it's been given as a penalty, what we typically might see is actually the athlete, the coach giving it as a corner instead, or giving it as a goal kick when it's a blatant penalty. The idea here is that you're trying to create an environment where the athlete is moving away from the emotion, understand they can't control what's just happened, and they must get on with the game. So refocusing their attention back on relevant cues. How we do that is, as I've mentioned, with game scenarios where you're asking, so a sports psych might actually say to the coach, I think it'd be a good idea to include a game scenario to create wrong decisions. You can make the players aware, but it may be based off, I purposely put this in to see how this athlete responds. So when the athlete's in that state, can we then tap into that coping mechanism and see if they're obviously doing what they've been working on with me privately? If not, things need to be addressed till we get it right. So then in the performance outcome, in a game situation, the athlete is then better able to regulate their emotion, stay on task relevant cues, and perform their best ability without all the negative bias going on around them. Okay. We also have obviously dysfunctional, so obviously motivational consequences. So there's dysfunctional emotions, optimal emotions. Again, it's very much related to how the athlete's feeling on that in the given moment. We often see athletes, well, when I'm working with, again, this could be children, when they mention to me before competition or again before assessments, they would say how they're feeling anxious. And I'm sure we've told our children, in the past that, trying to channel that anxiety or try to channel those butterflies or try to channel those nerves that you're feeling, there's every truth to that, that you should always continue to say that to your children. And what I often, when I'm doing some sprinting work with some of the children, what I'll often say to them is, when we're doing like an assessment type and we have like cones, so we may do like, say, a 60-meter sprint, and there'll be like 20-meter kind of like cones, so kind of checkpoints, so to speak. And I use video games as a reference, and I'll say to them, look, you see the start point, you see the finishing point. I want you to feel that emotion, feel that anxiety, which sometimes at a very young age, you may not use the word anxiety, you might use the word nervousness or butterflies. And I want you to imagine the butterflies are kind of creating a tunnel. And in this tunnel, you're kind of getting a kind of a surge of speed that's going to help you. And every time you're running past that cone, the 20-meter cone and the 40-meter cone, you're actually getting a power up. And that anxiety or that nervousness you feel, I want you to use it optimally, efficiently, and actually use the benefit, yourself in this moment. And that's going to have a monumental effect upon them. And often you can relate it to kind of, I use games like Mario Kart, which pretty much none of the kids ever play these days. But, in Mario Kart, when you kind of get the speed surge and you kind of go a little bit quicker, I try to reference that as a method to kind of teach them that if we can use that, the nervousness, as a way to kind of power surge and use the speed surge, it's going to really, really help you. And so what you're doing there from that sports psych point of view, and again, this could be with a child going to a competition, if looking at it from a teenager perspective, for the girls, before you're going into that competition mode, it's about you. This is a delicate topic, but what I say to people is that when your child or your teenager or whatever is on the way to an exam, on the way to a fixture, on the way to an event where where it requires a monumental effect, and trust me, I've been there. I was an athlete for 15 years. I was blessed to have an amazing career, and become an national champ before I retired. So I get how the athlete feels, to a certain extent, how I felt. But the biggest thing for me was that my coach never invalidated how I felt. If I felt nervous, if I felt the anxiety, pre-competition, my coach would often say to me, well, yeah, like what do you expect? You're about to go out and perform at the highest level, and so your body's preparing yourself for that. And then I'll say, well, I'm feeling self-doubt. Well, yeah, what do you expect? You're meant to be self-doubt. That's just how the brain mechanism works. And it's all backed up from psychology, by the way. I'm not just saying because my coach said it. So the message here is for me to a parent is to suggest that it's really, really imperative that you don't invalidate how your child's feeling or how your teenager's feeling. You actually validate their feelings, you listen, and then you go about how to obviously manage that expectations. So one of the athletes I'm working at the moment, he's 25 years old, on the verge of becoming professional, in marathon running, and he came from a place of quit the sport, didn't want to be a part of it 2 years ago. We kind of set up, and then obviously we're doing really, really well. The biggest success for him has been an element of he knows we're in it together, meaning if he goes to a race and messes up and things don't go to plan, there's no expectation of me that I'm going to leave him. The expectation is that I allow him to go and experiment. I allow him to go and express himself in these races. He's done all the conditioning work, all the training. So the only expectation for him to run a personal best, the only expectation for him to go out and run well is on him. He knows that if he runs poorly, then I will not be angry at him. I will not be sad with him or frustrated with him. He knows I'm an element of a safety net, that when things go bad, I will be there for him to pick up the pieces. And that's not me trying to be like a father or whatever, but that's how a coach should be. And you see it on TV a lot, in sports, and that's how athletes should be. Yes, some athletes need that kind of punch in the arm or that kind of roughened sort of approach in terms of, you need to be better, kind of shake them up a little bit. But athletes also need to know that you are there for them and you allow them to express themselves when they want to be, but you're also there to kind of help them when things aren't feeling great. And so the athlete I was talking about, he knows that things that don't go well, there's an element of safety there for him that he can always go back to. And we will draw up a plan, we'll go through feedback, and we'll move again forward, and we'll do it together. So once you kind of bridge that trust and gain that that connection with your athlete, with your child, with your teenager, then that's going to be a fantastic place to go from and to continue with. And so I know I've gone from a massive tangent there, but I think that was really important to say. So it's really about the kind of motivational consequences of that heightened emotion, is really understanding to how to optimize the energy when you want to. So allowing the athlete to express themselves, when they want to in a given moment. We know that self-talk is associated with emotion as well. So again, just be a little bit overhearing what your child is saying. Is it overly negative? What sort of words are they using? If it's quite powerful words, then you need to probably address it after the performance and try to kind of lessen some of the words they're using. When they're kind of using words that are kind of self-inflicting, that's when potentially I would advise to have a sit down with them after performance if they had a bad performance as well, because then it's starting to affect their self-esteem. Positive emotions around task enjoyment may influence persistence and commitment. Again, one of the things when working with teenagers, boys in particular, is when, again, from a sports psych point of view, parents come over and children typically, and I definitely did it as a teenager as well, put so much goddamn pressure on themselves to deliver all the time. They're comparing themselves to the best, which is very humanistic, obviously, but it's not always the most healthy and quite toxic. So going back to a place of where the sport is fun, you're getting the engagement from the athlete and they're walking away with a smile on their face. I know it sounds boring, I know it sounds not scientific, but you want to always go back to that place when your child isn't feeling at that kind of level. There's a real famous thing in running quote where often we say that I'd rather have my athlete, and it's very, very famous, rather have my athlete slightly undertrained but highly motivated going into the race than overtrained and not motivated, because the first one's always going to win. The first one's always going to be hungry. The first one's always going to be a bit happier and wanting to prove themselves at that next level. Whereas the one who's overtrained, not enjoying training, as it says here, is predominantly not going to do well, may even get a DNF and not finish the race or perform something bad in a tackle or whatnot. So again, it's very, very important to understand that, as you know, the child is a human, and to never ever forget that when dealing with this, they will experience sadness, they will experience worry, and often athletes, as it says here, athletes may have no issues of sadness and worry, but want to experience happiness and excitement. So if you do notice that your child is experiencing more issues in their training, or coming home from school, coming home from these training nights, and things just are looking a bit doom and gloom, a bit more negative than it is usually, then that's something to kind of take note of. It's something to address, and it's something to give your athlete or your child autonomy, or I keep saying athlete, I'm sorry, just my natural speaking language. It's really important to address that and understand that what is fundamentally the issue. Listening, obviously, of course, validating how they feel, because they're the individual going through the discomfort, going through the training process, putting the kid on, getting to training, doing the training, finishing the training, dealing with the emotions of winning and losing, if that is being a training or match outcome, processing that, which can take 2 or 3 days, obviously training through that process as well. There's a lot going on that I think sometimes we forget, as obviously I'm not a parent, but we forget as parents, or parents do forget, and even coaches typically forget as well. So that's very, very apparent. So, but understanding what things could be slightly addressed in order to help cope with them better, so they feel heard, they feel understood, and then they can improve that happiness and excitement going into it. There's never going to be a state in where an athlete is just going to be in a state of happiness completely. They should know that they're athletes. Failure is part of the journey. You know, one of the best quotes I ever heard was, "You haven't failed, you just haven't done it yet." I think that's a brilliant thing to use with any athlete. Something that I resonate with and use all the time. So that's something to really think about. And obviously, we're looking to when we get into the coping stages now of the presentation, is looking to address what can we change cognitively that's going to enhance their performance. So little things going back to the emotional state is going to help your child perform better in that match performance. So if you've been on the previous two sessions, you will recognize goal setting, obviously being one of the biggest ones. Reappraisal, imagery, and obviously self-talk is probably up there, one of the biggest things. Again, these are staple, fundamental, and going to make a huge difference for your child and your athlete going forward in the future. And so we know that through problem-focused coping, taking action to change the person around relationship, either alter the environment or changing one situation in the environment. So what this means essentially, you could, as a parent, if you're watching it from a training perspective or match perspective, there's one or two things you want to look out for. Is the environment benefiting my child, or is it not? And with that, what can be changed in the situation to make the environment better? So often, if things are really doom and gloom, what I sometimes advise the athletes to take maybe a week off, rethink the strategy of what they're going through and what needs to be altered. You know, that could be the parent talking to the coaches, or the athlete talking to the coaches of what needs to be changed going forward, in order to look at what needs to be performed better to get more out of the athlete from an individual perspective. Obviously, the emotion focused, which is what is in the mind of the athlete, and that can be looking at redirection or reinterpretation, what the athlete wants. Sometimes goal setting can, if not done correctly, can create unhealthy habits moving forward, leading to the athlete, perhaps trying to lose weight to make a certain cut for a race or for a game situation. So you want to kind of make the goal setting realistic moving forward, and again, giving the athlete autonomy in terms of redirection. What do they want presently, which we'll kind of tap into when it comes to the goal setting. So if you've seen the diagram before, we have obviously the process, performance, and outcome goal. So what I often say to people is, if your child is having a terrible time at the moment, in terms of their sport, often it's not bad to go back to just doing your best. Forgetting about the long-term goal, focusing on the short-term goals. When it comes to outcome goal and performance goals and process goals, which I won't go too much into because we did a whole talk on it before, but what I actually suggest is focus on the outcome goal first. So if we're looking at my athlete, for example, who wants to run 2:15 for the marathon, so that'd be the outcome goal for the marathon. The two performance goals underneath, you would be looking at perhaps a half marathon time, or maybe a key session that would obviously give him the confidence and boost his momentum and self-esteem moving forward. That will give him the best availability to perform at the outcome goal. And the process goals are things you do on a day-to-day basis. So that could be organization, consistency, training requirements, and things you can control in that given moment. Always, if you're looking to do this, you can take a screenshot it if you want, but always make sure that if you're doing this sort of goal setting approach with your child, you're making sure that the child is having a pretty strong inclination with what they view as a process goal, a performance goal, an outcome goal. Remember, it's not about you trying to motivate your child. The motivation has to come from the child itself, not itself, but him or herself, should I say. So that's the most, because then the child is given self-responsibility, or a teenager is given self-responsibility to do that, and it's on them. And you're then not falling on the responsibility of, well, I gave you this goal set to do, me got to do it. It's more about, well, this is on you, not me. But I'm here to listen and reevaluate if you have to. And that is a really brilliant thing. And as I mentioned, if the goal is becoming too far out of reach, you fall back on, let's just do our best for now. We can monitor our progression, almost micromanage how we're getting on, and we'll take it from there. Okay. Reappraising. So often this falls on the situation from an environment perspective. So how can an athlete a child reappraise the situation. So this can have a big impact upon their emotional response. So what we're looking to achieve here is move an athlete from being in a threat state and into a challenge state. How that can be reappraised is obviously based on the stimulus and the emotional impact it is having on them. So if it's having a big emotional impact on the child or the athlete and they're not able to deal, or what's the word, sort of fix these emotions, they're going to automatically fall into that threat state, believing they have insufficient resources on a physiological level and psychological level, meaning they're going to have negative emotions and they're more unlikely to feel their potential, leading them to obviously have a poor performance outcome, lowering confidence, lowering self-esteem, and then probably wanting to move away from that sport or move away from, or shadowing themselves in the next performance. And so it's really, really important that we try to counter those thoughts and look at what's actually happened in the past that can really, really help them in this moment. So we're not trying to focus overly on negative emotions, but more so on positive. So think back to past memories where things work really well for the athlete, how that can help optimize their performance. Because we know that the brain can't differentiate between what's happening and what's not real. So if we're literally focusing on positive emotions, positive experiences before a game situation, so it could be your child scoring 3 goals, could be winning a rowing race, could be winning a tennis match, could be, doing a fantastic pass in rugby, the body starts to respond to that accordingly. And the person goes into the match feeling more fixated on the positive emotions than the negative. And you reintroduce that sort of method in training and in racing and performance. And soon, what you'll see is that the athlete or your child will naturally fall into a more positive state going into competition, which you want to do. So that's all by just reappraising the situation to how they think it can be done positively. And so again, aim is to help an athlete become aware of their ideal emotional state can be the first step in attaining emotional control. So when we're looking at performance outcomes, where and which is the athlete can perform at their best level? How does it look from an emotional standpoint? Is actually some children and some athletes actually perform well when they are feeling very, very nervous because they have the coping mechanisms to deal with that. So what we're always looking to do is create a non-judgmental place for them where they can express themselves and they can find that middle line in terms of actually, this is the emotional state I'm trying to get myself to. This is what I have to do to get there, which can be done through that whole process on performance goal outcomes. Sometimes it could be through positive self-talk or that kind of imagery, as I mentioned. And that's the state they can remain themselves in going into that competition. And that's going to obviously be a massive impact. The biggest thing there also is obviously the awareness of conscious and unconscious thoughts. That's probably been the biggest A game for me in my career, was being aware of what was I thinking? Was it positive or negative? Was this thought helping me? Was this thought helping me go into my performance, or was it not? If it wasn't, I'll try and put it to bed. If it was, I'll keep it there and make it louder, make it scream. And that, on a repeated basis, again, you fall into a automatic response where actually you began to think more positively, you think negatively, because you weren't really giving the negative emotions any kind of energy in that given moment. Imagery, as we know, I think this is massive in motorsport, but obviously we're seeing a lot of it in other sports as well. And you could typically say it's visualization as well, is before the games for your child or before races, whatnot, is recreating positive experiences. Again, falling back on experience. It's going to have a big, big impact for them. And not only does this translate from sport, but also academics as well. So following on that positive experiences they've had in their chosen fields and pitching themselves, doing very well in the future. You often see this with Formula One drivers, as you can see, where they do some amazing research. And I think there's a video somewhere I saw on LinkedIn recently, but it was of Lando Norris, and he essentially had his eyes closed, and they had a video behind him on a racetrack that he didn't know what the racetrack was, going round and round and round, and he knew exactly where he was on the racetrack and when to shift gears or when to kind of push and accelerate and when to back off. That is visualization to a T. And so if we can get our children and athletes into that kind of visualization sort of setup before their performances, it's going to make a huge difference. And then visualizing themselves doing well, visualizing themselves maybe going through a problem in a game scenario and how to fix that in that given moment. And obviously self-talk. We all do it. And I think it's just, again, I'll repeat myself here, is just to be aware of and listening out for any kind of negative chat that could be happening. We don't want them to kind of fall into any maladaptive thoughts, but to also, always remain positive and neutral. So maladaptive thoughts could be thoughts that are negative and aren't going to help the performance. And again, it's a process that takes time. And rather than you kind of getting in and saying, well, you just said something wrong, you made negative self-talk about yourself, get them to explore why. Where's that thought coming from? Why is it happening? What experiences brought that into mind for you? And explore it. And often it will be something in the head that's so big, but actually is very, very small. And you can easily change that maladaptive thought into a positive one. Okay. And I think lastly, almost there, is to express and suppress. I think, typically it's kind of a debate. For me, I'm more of the kind of stoic approach to things, where I think it's actually important to retain how you feel emotionally. I think Roger Federer, depends on the sport, I guess. I think Roger Federer was obviously a legend at doing this in terms of not showing any emotion, giving his opponent zero kind of ammunition moving forward. But we do know that, as it says here, initiating emotionally expressively can slightly increase the feeling of that emotion. So trying to big yourself up, I think Andy Murray springs to mind when trying to get the crowd behind him. So that can obviously intensify it. There are physiological advances as well in terms of it can intensify the feeling. But again, it's teaching a child when to be aware of when and not to kind of use these emotions to their benefit. So if you're going to kind of get that last 10 minutes of a game, the last part of a race, what emotions can we use to enhance the performance a little bit more to get an extra kind of 1% out of them? And lastly, the cognitive cost associated with emotional inhibition. So it's looking at, again, falling back into the emotional experience, what needs to be addressed so the athlete is going into the performance not only physically ready, but also psychologically ready. So are they reaching a point where they're going into this event feeling that they are at the optimal physical level, but also going into it on a psychological level, they're feeling prepped, they're feeling ready, and they're able to be aware of those conscious and unconscious thoughts that come into our head, and they can perform their best level when they need to. Okay, I know that was a lot. I probably went off on a tangent a number of times, so I do apologize for that. But is there any questions? Let me quickly check. I didn't ask, to be fair, so I'm not surprised. For those who do have any questions, please just drop me an email. So that's joshua.trigwell@serviceandhire.com. I hope you got something out of today. I know I went off a few times on what I was saying, but I just tried to cram everything in one moment on that. But yeah, hope this helps you, helps your children. And I said, any questions, please do let me know, and I'll get back to you. We can have a chat, and we'll take it from there. But thank you for joining, and I'll see you next time for the last one. Thank you very much.